Welcome to Stillwater Chronicles. Tonight, we settle into a story about a room that should not exist. There is something about very clear water that feels like honesty, not the shallow clarity of a swimming pool. That artificial blue, that chemical clean. No, this is different. This is the clarity of a lake that has been cold since the last ice age, fed by glacier melt, undisturbed by current or tide, or season. A lake whose surface barely ripples even in wind. A lake that holds the sky and returns it to you without a single distortion. That is the lake Yusuf had come to dive. He had read about it in a technical diving journal, one of those dense, precise publications written by people who treat depth the way others treat mathematics, a language of numbers, visibility, salinity, thermoclines, descent rates. The lake had been described there with the quiet reverence those writers reserved for exceptional things: exceptional visibility, exceptional depth, exceptional stillness. He had driven 4 hours from Zurich in the early morning, the Alps rising pale and enormous around the valley as he descended toward it. And when he finally saw the lake, when he came around a bend in the road, and there it was, long and still, and impossibly blue between its dark green banks. He had stopped the car without thinking. He had simply stopped, and looked, and felt something he could not name. Not beauty, exactly. Something older than beauty. Something that precedes it. He geared up slowly at the water's edge. It was early enough that there was no one else there. No hikers on the path above. No boats on the far shore. No sound at all except the distant drip of snowmelt somewhere in the rocks, and the soft occasional movement of the water at his feet. The air was cold and thin, and tasted faintly of stone. Yusuf had been diving for 11 years. He was not an impulsive person. He checked his equipment with the quiet thoroughness of someone who had learned, over time, that the underwater world did not forgive inattention. He tested his regulators. He checked his tanks. 2 side-mounted cylinders, each trimix filled for the depth he intended. He reviewed his dive computer. He ran through the plan in his head the way he always did. Descent, level off, bottom, time, ascent, decompression stops. He attached his camera to its mount on his right wrist, checked the angle of the lens, pressed record, then stopped it. He would start recording on entry. He waded in. The cold came immediately, that particular cold of glacial water that is less a temperature and more a presence. It pressed against his dry suit, firm and total. He exhaled slowly. He deflated his wing. And then, with a small tilt forward, he let the weight of his tanks take him under. The descent was silent. That is the only word for it. Beneath the surface, the lake became something else entirely. Not a body of water, but a body of light. The clarity was unlike anything he had encountered in 11 years. He could see the bottom from the surface. He could see it. At 40 meters, the rock floor was visible below him, as clearly as if it were behind glass. Pale gray stone, scattered with what looked like ancient sediment, undisturbed and smooth. No fish at this depth. No plant life. No movement of any kind. Just the rock. And the cold. And the extraordinary, vertiginous stillness. He checked his depth gauge. 12 meters. He continued down. 20 meters. The light began to shift. Still present, still reaching him from above, but cooler now. Thinner. the way afternoon light is different from morning light, even at the same angle. He exhaled and watched the bubbles rise above him in a loose, spreading column, catching what remained of the light as they went. 30 meters. He equalized his ears, checked his gauges. His descent rate was steady. His breathing was slow. He had done this many times. 40 meters. Here the color changed. Not disappeared, changed. The blue deepened from the translucent glass-like blue of the shallows into something richer, darker, almost indigo. And below 40 meters, as the journal had noted with its careful precision, the water did not look dark the way most deep water looks dark. It looked black, not the murky black of silt or poor visibility, a different kind of black, a black that was, itself, a kind of clarity, as though, below a certain depth, the lake had simply stopped pretending. He leveled off at 50 meters. He was here for the rock face. The eastern wall of the lake was, according to the journal, a near vertical cliff of glaciated limestone that dropped from the surface to the bottom without interruption. A clean, smooth sheet of pale gray rock. Divers who had surveyed it reported excellent structure for photography. The play of light on limestone at depth. The visual effect of looking up along a vertical face from the darkness. Worth documenting, the journal had said, with characteristic restraint. Yusuf turned east and began finning toward it. The wall appeared gradually, a shift in the quality of the darkness ahead of him, a texture emerging from the uniform blue-black of the water. He slowed. He switched on his torch. The beam caught the rock face and rendered it in sharp detail. Pale gray, veined with darker lines, crystalline in places where the stone had fractured and rehealed over centuries. Beautiful, in the way geological things are beautiful, without effort, without intention. He pressed record on his camera. He followed the wall northward, keeping perhaps 2 meters of distance, his torch moving slowly across the surface of the rock. He was looking for nothing in particular. That was the pleasure of exploratory diving. The absence of agenda, the simple movement through a space no one was meant to occupy. He almost missed it. It was the regularity that caught his eye. Stone is not regular. Even the smoothest glaciated limestone has variation, a roughness at the micro level, a wavering in the lines, a natural asymmetry that the eye registers without processing. But there was something in the rock face ahead of him that was not varying, something that was, in fact, perfectly straight. He stopped finning. He hovered. He moved the torch beam slowly, deliberately, across the rock. A vertical line, then another, parallel to it, approximately 80 centimeters away. And between them, a horizontal line at the top, and another at the bottom. A rectangle, cut into the rock. Yusuf did not move for a moment. His breathing, already slow, slowed further. The bubbles from his regulator rose in their steady column and disappeared into the dark above him. He looked at the rectangle in the rock, and his mind cycled through the possibilities with the methodical patience of someone trained to think clearly in adverse conditions. Natural formation. Highly unlikely. Those lines were too straight, the corners too precise. Survey marker. Possible, but he had seen no documentation of any structured work on this wall. The journal had made no mention of it. Something else. He finned closer. The rectangle resolved, at close range, into a doorway. A door frame, to be exact, cut cleanly into the limestone, approximately 2 meters tall and 80 centimeters wide, with a recessed channel where a door might once have been seated. The rock inside the channel was smooth, worked. This had been made by hands, with tools. At what point in history, and by whom, and for what possible reason? He could not begin to answer. But the doorway was there, and beyond the doorway, his torch beam reached into a darkness that did not end at rock. He paused at the threshold for a long time. He checked his gauges. His air was adequate. His decompression obligation was manageable. He was not in danger. He knew he should ascend, return with a dive buddy, document the location properly, report it. He knew all of this. He was a careful person. An 11-year diver. Someone who had learned patience. He ducked through the doorway. The passage beyond was short, no more than 3 meters. And then it opened into a room. Yusuf stopped breathing. Not literally. His regulator continued its rhythm, and his chest continued to rise and fall. But the cognitive part of him, the part that processed and responded and decided what to do next, went entirely still. The room was perhaps 4 meters by 4 meters, cut from the same pale gray limestone. The walls were smooth. The ceiling was low. He would have had to duck slightly to stand upright, had standing been possible. And in the room there was a table, wooden, rectangular, perhaps 1.5 meters long. 2 chairs, one on each long side. Also wooden, with straight backs. The kind of chair you might find at a kitchen table in a house that valued utility over comfort. And on the table, a lamp, an oil lamp, he thought. The shape was unmistakable, even here, even now. A base, a stem, a glass chimney. Unlit. Sitting at the center of the table with the same unconcerned solidity as a lamp sitting on any table, in any room, anywhere in the world. And beside the lamp, a cup. Ceramic. Plain. Sitting on the table as though someone had just set it down and stepped out for a moment. Yusuf hovered in the doorway of that room, at the bottom of a glacial lake in the Swiss Alps, and tried to assemble what he was seeing into something coherent. He could not. He moved his torch slowly around the room. The walls held nothing. No markings, no shelves, no fixtures of any kind. The floor was stone, flat and swept-looking, though there was no sediment here, nothing that could have been swept. The ceiling was the same pale gray as the walls. The whole space had a quality of, he searched for the right word, waiting. Not abandonment. Waiting. There was no current in the room. The water was absolutely still. His bubbles rose and pressed against the ceiling and sat there, motionless, gathering. He thought about the cup. He thought about how it looked, the shape of it, the plainness of it, the way it was positioned on the table, not pushed to one side, not overturned, not half buried in sediment as you would expect from an object that had been underwater for any meaningful length of time. It looked recent. He didn't touch anything. He photographed the room carefully, the table, the chairs, the lamp, the cup, moving his torch to illuminate each object in turn, making sure the camera captured what he was seeing. He spent perhaps 4 minutes in the room. Then he turned, ducked back through the passage, and began his ascent. He surfaced into the late morning. The Alps were still enormous around the valley. The lake was still still. The air was cold and thin and tasted of stone. He pulled off his mask and looked at the sky for a moment. That particular sky-blue sky that comes after weather has passed and left everything washed clean. He swam slowly to shore. He sat on a rock at the water's edge and removed his equipment piece by piece and set it beside him and looked at the lake. He felt with some precision what he had felt on the road when he first saw it. That wordless recognition of something older than beauty. But differently now. Weighted differently. He reviewed the footage on his camera while he waited for his breathing to fully slow. The visibility was excellent. The camera had captured everything clearly. The rock face, the doorway, the passage, the room. He watched the footage of the room with the careful attention of someone who suspects they may have been mistaken and is checking. He had not been mistaken. He watched the footage of the table, the lamp, the cup. He paused the footage. He watched it again. The cup was steaming. Not dramatically. Not a plume, not a gust. A thin, delicate curl of something rising from the rim of the cup, visible only because his torch had caught it at exactly the right angle. Because the water in the room had been so absolutely still that even this faint movement registered. Something in the cup, something warm enough to steam. At 52 meters below the surface of a lake whose temperature, at that depth, was less than 4 degrees Celsius. Yusuf sat at the edge of the lake for a long time. He watched the surface of the water. It gave nothing back. That flat, honest blue. That stillness that had no information in it. He thought about the room. He thought about who could have made it, and when, and whether there was an access point he had not found. Some passage from the shore. Some entrance at a different depth. Some explanation that would arrange these things into order. He thought about the cup. He did not come up with an explanation, not an adequate one. His mind returned again and again to the footage, that thin curl of something rising from the ceramic rim, visible for perhaps 3 seconds before his angle changed, and it disappeared. He had been there. The room had been empty. The water had been still. And yet, he packed his equipment slowly, with the same thoroughness he had unpacked it. He checked that his camera was safely stowed. He recorded the GPS coordinates of his entry point in his dive log, noted the depth and bottom time, and beside the entry, wrote 3 words that he immediately crossed out and did not rewrite. He started his car. He drove the 4 hours back to Zurich as the light changed from morning to afternoon to the long, golden, fading light of a Swiss spring evening. He did not stop. He did not turn around. He has not gone back. Not yet. The footage is saved on his hard drive. He's watched it perhaps a dozen times. Each time, the same details. The lamp, the chairs, the table, the cup. And each time, in the last 3 seconds of his time in that room, the same thin thread of warmth rising from the ceramic rim. He has told one person, a fellow diver, someone he trusts. He described the room, the stillness, the objects. and at the end he described the steam. His friend was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Was the second chair pulled out or pushed in?" Yusuf didn't answer. He had not looked at the second chair closely enough to know. He has watched the footage many times since then. He has paused it. He has enlarged it. He has adjusted the brightness and the contrast and the angle. The second chair, as best he can tell, is pulled out slightly from the table, as though someone had just stood up. Thank you for listening to Stillwater Chronicles, where even the deepest silence holds a question. If this stillness stayed with you, if the cold of that water settled somewhere slow and quiet, then let it remain a little while longer. Some rooms were not meant to be found, and yet, somehow, they are. Rest now. The surface is far above you, and the dark below does not rush.